Welcome back. Sometimes the simplest, most mundane things can cause problems, and sometimes those problems can explode out of all proportion with their cause. Take, for example, yeast. Yeast is a living single-cell fungus used to make bread rise, among other things. It works by consuming sugars and producing carbon dioxide gas, which gets trapped in the dough and makes it expand. This is why bread that contains yeast, which is known as leavened bread, becomes light and airy. You don't have to use yeast in bread. There are plenty of breads that don't. Tortillas, chapati, matzah, for instance, are all examples of unleavened bread. And which you prefer, leavened or unleavened, depends on your taste and the meal, I guess. Probably not something you'd want to get into an argument over. Except, if you've been paying any attention over the course of this series, you'll know that the Byzantine Empire was, above all, a Christian empire. And if you know anything about the Christian church, you'll know they love a good ceremony. And in some of their ceremonies, they use bread. And then suddenly the issue of whether you use yeast, that simple one-celled fungus, can become very, very important indeed. In July 1054, a papal delegation led by Cardinal Humbert placed a bull of excommunication on the altar of the Hagia Sophia. The document declared the patriarch and his close supporters excommunicated, accusing them of various doctrinal and disciplinary errors, and it was issued in the name of Pope Leo IX. Pope Leo's decision to issue the bull stemmed from a chain of escalating provocations centered on disputes in southern Italy and broader assertions of papal authority. The immediate catalyst was Patriarch Cerularius's closure of Latin Rite churches in Constantinople over the use of unleavened bread. The Western Church used unleavened bread and the Eastern Church used leavened bread, and the bull was intended to compel Cerularius to recognize papal supremacy in rulings over such matters. Fun fact, Leo actually died in April 1054 before the legates even reached Constantinople, which actually invalidated the bull's authority, since papal legates' powers lapse with the Pope's death. Ignoring this, Humbert, by all accounts a rather irascible fellow, proceeded undeterred. In response, Cerularius convened a synod in Constantinople and formally condemned and excommunicated Humbert and the others in the delegation, treating their act as an illegitimate and provocative insult to the Church of Constantinople. These mutual excommunications, although technically directed at individuals rather than whole churches, became the symbolic breaking point that crystallized the long-building estrangement between the West and the East into an open and lasting schism, what came to be known as the Great Schism. Now, I'm exaggerating for effect when I say this was all over the use of yeast in bread making. It's true that was the final straw, but the split between the Western and Eastern churches was the culmination of many centuries of growing distance. At its core, as with so many disputes, was an argument over who was in charge, whether the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, held universal jurisdiction over all Christians, or whether he was simply the first among equals within a broader family of patriarchs. Western theologians argued that the Pope, as successor of Peter, possessed supreme and direct authority over the entire Church, including the Eastern Patriarchates. Eastern leaders upheld a model of conciliarity in which Rome held a primacy of honour, but not of absolute legal jurisdiction over the other patriarchates of Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Alongside this ran developing differences in theology, worship, language, and political culture between the Latin-speaking West and the Greek-speaking East. Tensions flared whenever Rome tried to intervene in Eastern affairs, or when Constantinople resisted Roman claims. This clash of ecclesiologies, one more centralized and jurisdictional, the other more collegial and synodal, made compromise difficult because it touched the very question of who had the right to define orthodoxy. Doctrinal and liturgical disagreements took on symbolic weight. Issues like the Western additions to the Nicene Creed, the West's insistence on clerical celibacy for most priests, Western debates about purgatory and the use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist. None of these things were fully shared or accepted in the East, and over time, these disagreements became markers of identity. Western Christians might see Eastern resistance as stubborn or even heretical, while Eastern Christians might see Western changes as unauthorized innovations that threatened the received faith. By the mid-11th century, each side increasingly saw the other as alien, even while they still regarded one another as part of the same church. And all of this unfolded within a context of widening political and cultural distance between the Latin West and the Greek East. Before the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, there was one person in overall charge of doctrinal matters, the emperor. When that disappeared in the West, the Bishop of Rome rose in relative prominence there, while in the East, the emperor in Constantinople continued to act as a Christian ruler, deeply involved in church life. The two halves of Christendom developed different relationships between church and state, spoke different languages, and faced different political pressures, whether from Germanic kingdoms in the West or Persians and then later Muslims in the East. Misunderstandings were compounded by stereotypes and mutual suspicion. Controversies over icons or disputes in southern Italy over which liturgical customs should prevail fed the sense that the other side was untrustworthy. So against this backdrop, the mutual excommunications of 1054 really formalized an already existing breach. And this was no trivial matter. The great schism between the Western Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church is still a thing. It means something very concrete and also something deeply symbolic. In Christian ecclesiology, being in communion isn't just friendliness or agreement, it's a specific, structured relationship. When the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches are described as out of communion, it means a lot of specific things. Firstly, they don't share the Eucharist, which for believers is probably the most emotionally significant consequence. A Catholic cannot normally receive communion in an Orthodox liturgy, and an Orthodox Christian cannot normally receive communion in a Catholic Mass. They don't recognize each other's church governance, so each side sees itself as preserving the correct structure of the church. The Catholic Church recognizes the Pope as having universal jurisdiction, while the Orthodox churches reject this, recognizing only their own synods and patriarchs. Because they disagree on who has authority, they can't function as one body, and they don't make joint decisions as one church. In the early centuries of the church, bishops met in ecumenical councils to settle disputes, but now the Catholic Church holds its own councils and the Orthodox churches hold their own synods. But very importantly, despite all these differences, they still recognize each other as authentically Christian. Neither side considers the other as a false religion. The phrase often used today is imperfect communion, which means a recognition that the two churches share the same ancient roots, the same sacraments in a form, and the same early councils, but they don't share full sacramental life or governance. They also both pray for unity, although if it hasn't happened after 1,000 years, you have to wonder. Anyway, a few years after this mutual excommunication, Alexios Komnenos was born into a prominent Byzantine aristocratic family. He was the third son of John Komnenos, a respected military commander and brother of Emperor Isaac I, and Anna Dalasena from the influential Dalasenos clan. After John's death in 1067, Anna dominated family affairs, forging alliances and instilling martial values in sons Alexios, Isaac, and Adrianos, while ensuring loyalty to imperial service. Alexios began military service in his late teens under Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes, fighting with distinction in campaigns against the Seljuk Turks leading up to, but probably not at, the disastrous Battle of Manzikert in 1071. Under Michael VII Ducas, Alexios demonstrated his tactical brilliance by suppressing Norman mercenary Roussel de Balouis' revolt in Asia Minor around 1073, using deception to turn foes against each other. Promoted swiftly under Nicephorus III, Alexios crushed major rebellions. In 1078, as commander of the Western Field Army, he defeated Nicephorus Bryennius the Elder, then routed Nicephorus Basilakes in a nighttime assault. These victories earned him the top military post of commander-in-chief of the Byzantine Field Army by late 1078. Despite his youth, he would have been around 21 at the time, exceptionally young for such a role. This was only second to the emperor, and holders were typically senior battle-tested generals or older aristocrats with decades of service. Command of the field army was not normally entrusted to someone barely out of adolescence. Even princes rarely held such authority before the late 20s or 30s, but Alexios' appointment was enabled by somewhat extraordinary circumstances. The empire was in crisis after Manzikert, and the Komnenoi were one of the few families with intact military networks. His mother Anna Dalasena and the Dukhoi faction strongly backed him, and the reality was that Nicephorus III needed a capable general loyal to him, even if he was exceptionally young. 1078 was a big year for young Alexios, as he married Eileen Dukaina, granddaughter of Constantine X Ducas, cementing Komnenos Ducas ties and providing dynastic legitimacy alongside her wealth and connections to Bulgarian royalty. The marriage produced critical heirs, including daughter Anna Komneni, whose Alexiad chronicles her father's era, and also the future emperor John II Komnenos. Anyway, by 1081, Nicephorus III's regime was weakening against Norman invasions, led by Robert Guiscard, and ongoing Seljuk threats from the east, eroding army loyalty. It was time for someone to do something. Alexios, backed by brother Isaac, mother Anna, and other allies, led his forces into Constantinople, forcing Nicephorus to flee to a monastery. Crowds proclaimed Alexios emperor in the Hippodrome, and Patriarch Cosmas I crowned him on April 4th in Hagia Sophia. At about 25 years old, Alexios became emperor, founding the Komnenian dynasty that stabilized Byzantium for decades. But first, there was a lot of work to do. Emperor is not an easy job, particularly at this point in Byzantium's history. Alexios inherited an empire in acute crisis, with simultaneous military, fiscal, political, and religious problems pressing in on him from every direction. The empire had lost most of Anatolia to the Seljuk Turks after Manzikert, including key economic and recruiting grounds, which left the eastern frontier shattered and Constantinople exposed. There was an imminent northern invasion under Robert Guiscard from the west, which threatened the Balkans. Pechenegs menaced the Danubian frontier, threatening to launch large-scale invasions which would add a northern front to his problems on the western and eastern fronts. When it came to the empire's finances, the imperial treasury was heavily depleted after decades of civil war, mercenary hiring and territorial loss, leaving Alexios short of cash to pay troops and allies. The long-standing gold currency that he would pay them with had also been badly debased, undermining confidence in imperial money and complicating taxation and the payment of soldiers. The influx of refugees from lost Anatolian territories strained the capital's resources, while core tax bases in Anatolia and in parts of the Balkans no longer reliably remitted revenue to the centre. And then there's politics. With Byzantium, there's always politics. As acclaimed by the crowds as he might have been, Alexios' seizure of power from Nicephorus was still a military coup, creating distrust among sections of the capital elite and leaving him reliant on a narrow coalition of the Komnenoi and Dukai families. Powerful families, yes, but not overwhelmingly so, and far from the only powerful families with their eyes on power. Multiple potential pretenders and disgruntled magnates remained in or around the empire, generating plots and uprisings over the course of his reign, each of which had to be dealt with. There were heretical movements active in Thrace and the Balkans, sometimes revolting and aligning with external enemies like the Pechenegs, forcing Alexios to shore up his religious legitimacy by dealing with these doctrinal deviants and intellectuals, all of which consumed political capital and attention. And then there's the fact that central authority has eroded over the last decade or so due to repeated short reigns and civil wars, weakening the army, the provincial administration, and the tax collection mechanisms, the very things Alexios needs in order to be able to rebuild the empire. And all of this is complicated by the growing power of great aristocratic families, including his own, making it harder to re-centralize authority and forcing him to rule through family networks rather than a fully impartial bureaucracy. So in the light of all this, why on earth would a 25-year-old want to become emperor? The answer, of course, is a mix of personal ambition, family pressure, and a genuine conviction that only he and his family could rescue the collapsing empire. There were certainly a lot of factors acting in his favour. He came from a leading military aristocratic house with emperors in its ancestry, and Anna Komneni consistently presents him as someone whose abilities and temperament were suited to rule, not to remain a subordinate general, although, again, important to remember, she was his daughter. It's true that by the late 1070s he had already outshone many rivals in campaigns against rebels and Turks, which strengthened the perception, his own and others, that he was the natural candidate for the throne in a time of crisis. And through his marriage to Irene Dukaina, Alexios had merged Komnenos and Dukas interests, giving his bid a kind of dynastic logic or even inevitability. This perception seems to have been strongly encouraged by his mother and the Empress Maria, who actively courted him into conspiracy, promising the backing of major aristocratic networks in return for seizing the throne. Nikephoros appeared old, indecisive, and unable to stem territorial losses, financial collapse, and external threats. Anna Komneni's narrative frames Alexios taking power as a duty. If a capable general didn't act, the empire would continue to disintegrate under failing leadership. So cometh the hour, cometh the man, and Alexios finds himself in the palace with a daunting to-do list. Where to begin? The most pressing threat was coming from the west, so almost immediately after taking power, Alexios offered peace terms to Robert Guiscard in an attempt to head off the northern campaign that was already being prepared. However, Robert refused and proceeded with the invasion of the Western Balkans. Suddenly, Alexios faced his first major test as emperor, forcing him to shift rapidly from palace politics to field command. The Byzantine army was not the fearsome and unstoppable force it had once been, and Alexios' first battle against Robert's forces was one-sided, with the Normans routing the Byzantines and completely destroying Alexios' Varangian forces. Perhaps to a lesser man, falling at the first hurdle like this would have been enough to stop him, or at least give him pause, but Alexios was made of sterner and more cunning stuff. He paid the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV to invade Norman Italy, forcing Robert to take some of his forces back to Italy to deal with that problem, leaving the remainder in the hands of his son Bohemond. Alexios then orchestrated a feigned retreat with a decoy force under his brother Adrianos, carrying the imperial standard, luring Bohemond's Normans into an ambush at Lycostomium, where elite Byzantine cavalry and mounted archers inflicted heavy Norman losses and forced Bohemond to retreat. By 1085, Alexios had recovered most of the ground lost to the Normans, just in time to turn north to deal with the long-threatened Pecheneg invasion. The Pecheneg horde, about 80,000 strong, crossed the Danube in the spring of 1087, plundered widely through the northern Balkans, and approached close to Constantinople. Contemporary accounts emphasized the panic in Constantinople from their proximity. But Alexios' field campaigns and skirmishes prevented a siege, and subsequent raids stayed further north, with Alexios eventually ending the threat via diplomacy, partial settlements, and the use of mercenaries to supplement his forces. So, having held off the Normans and successfully defeated the Pechenegs, thereby holding off the threats to the west and the north, Alexios decided to deal with the threats of the Seljuk Turks to the east. Post-Manzikert, Seljuks controlled most of Asia Minor, raiding deep into Bithynia and threatening Nicaea, only 90 kilometers or so from Constantinople. Alexios' peasant militias and coastal defences checked them temporarily, but he lacked the numbers for reconquest. He needed to get more soldiers from somewhere. Alexios turned to the west, asking for Western European knights via embassies to Flanders, Hungary, and ultimately to Pope Urban II in 1095, explicitly requesting 2,000 to 10,000 professional cavalry to shield his frontiers and recover key fortresses. This was perfectly normal and not at all out of the ordinary. A simple request for mercenary fighters. It wasn't the first time Byzantium had recruited mercenaries from the west, and contemporary sources frame it as a pragmatic manpower procurement, underscoring Alexios' consistent use of gold and diplomacy over mass Byzantine mobilization. What was out of the ordinary, what was extraordinary, was what Pope Urban did when he received the request. We'll look at that and the unexpected response Alexios got from the West next time. But for now, thanks very much for joining me. Please remember to like, share and subscribe on the way out, and whatever you're up to, have a great day.